Hello and welcome to the latest video brought to you by NAHT and NAHT Edge. This time we're talking about resilience and more specifically resilience in school leaders. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Julia Steward. Julia has written extensively on this topic and she speaks about it regularly too. Julia, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, James.
Let me start by asking, so let's start to talk about definitions. What exactly do we mean when we're talking about emotional resilience in school leaders, and why is it such an important topic, do you think?
Okay, so unfortunately there isn't a sort of an accepted definition of emotional resilience or resilience itself. There are lots of different definitions. When I work with people, I generally ask them, what are some of the words that come to mind, and they talk about bouncing back and being able to keep going, sustainability. Some people talk about adaptability. In the sort of academic literature, there's a variety. Patterson and Kelleher talk about coming back stronger than before from adversity, and say that actually it's really important that you reflect on those experiences to make you stronger. In the writing that I've done, I came up with this definition of emotional resilience, and I talk about emotional resilience because I think it's when our emotions overwhelm us that we lose our sense of direction and we're likely to be hijacked. So my kind of definition for the book really was to be able to sustain emotional connection and your sense of travel without being overwhelmed.
And I suspect this is going to be a topic that resonates with lots of school leaders, because often school leaders are having to draw on resilience very regularly in their job.
Absolutely.
I suppose the million-dollar question in this is, well, what can school leaders do, would you advise, in order to build up their resilience?
I think it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge that school leaders would not be school leaders if they didn't have resilience. So I'm not saying, this is what you need to do, but there is something about sustaining it. And John West Burnham talks about a resilience reservoir and talks about the fact that the emotions that are drawn on in a school are things like hope, optimism, courage. You can have 3 weeks when you're just kind of going through the normal day, whatever that is in school, but then there might be some sort of crisis and you really have to draw on that resilience reservoir. And I think in schools, resilience is important for any leader, emotional resilience, because leadership is an emotional activity. But in schools, when you consider what parents are doing when they hand over their children, the creatures that probably mean more to them than anything else in the world, they hand over their children to schools. There's a lot of emotion invested there. There are people in schools, young people who haven't yet learned to deal with, to manage their own emotions. And there are young people, there are teenagers who are hormones racing and all that, so that's a lot of emotion. It's all about relationships, that's an emotional connection. So I think the whole, schools are much more, quotes, emotional places, by which I don't mean everybody's crying, but much more emotion rich places than many other leadership contexts, I would say. So I think that's why it's really important, and if the leader goes down, then the school isn't going to function as effectively as it would do otherwise.
So is this about school leaders just remembering to look after themselves, to go home early a couple of nights a week, to practice mindfulness? What is it about in terms of leaders actually trying to develop that resilience, or is it just about actually the longer you spend on the job, the more resilient you become?
I think there is a bit of that it comes with wisdom, experience and so on, but I think there are things you can do to support your resilience. And yes, all the things that you've talked about, looking after your well-being, maybe practicing mindfulness, etc., are important. But I think there's a range of things that connect to impact on resilience, emotional resilience. So well-being, I would say, is absolutely the first thing. Look after yourself. We know that when we feel well, we're much more able to do what we want to do and to feel sort of energetic and to be able to cope with life. So that's the first thing. And when we look after ourselves, when we exercise and sleep and all those things, sleep, I would say, is absolutely the foundation. But when we do all those things, we have more energy. And when we have more energy, we're more able to keep going, so that makes us more resilient. But we can use energy unproductively in worry, in doing things that maybe aren't our main focus, those kind of things. So we need to have a sense of agency as well. So how am I using my energy? How can I take control of that? And that all kind of would work well, but there's the whole thing also of what's happening deep inside. You know, what are my core beliefs, and how do they impact on how I behave? And even that isn't the end. There's also the whole thing about the system in which we operate. We are both influencing and influenced by the system in which we operate, and the leadership, the school system, has an impact obviously on the leaders who work within it.
And one of the things you talk about in the book that struck me is that often leaders find it very difficult to switch off. And that definitely resonated with me in my experience. And you talk about school leaders often being high ruminators.
Yeah.
Can you just explain about what you mean about this idea that we're high ruminators often? And again, critically, well, what can we do to stop it if it's a problem?
Yes. I think actually the research that I was drawing on was by Mark Cropley, whose book The Off Switch talks about an experiment that he did. It was actually with teachers, not with leaders. And I think most leaders, by the time they get to leadership, they've learned to manage this a little. But the whole thing about ruminating is when you can't put something down. You know, you come home at the end of the day, and there's all that stuff that you might have done differently rolling around in your head, all the stuff that you've got to do tomorrow. And some people manage just to leave that behind. So there are strategies. I can remember coming across a head on one occasion who said when he leaves the school in the evening, he backs away, puts his hands up, and then gets in the car. And that's where he's leaving all his stuff. Mark Cropley's research talks about specific things that you can do to tell yourself it's time to switch off from work, like changing your clothes. You know, you're now home from work. Not putting supper in the microwave and then taking it out 10 minutes later, eating it and carrying on, but stopping and cooking a meal, for example, taking the dog for a walk, anything that signals this is the end of the school day, which connects your body and your mind to say this is a signal that the end of the day has come and I can switch off. And then there's the stuff that you've already talked about, mindfulness, for example, training your brain just to notice when you are getting sucked into what happens if, and you know, they're only thoughts. Actually, they're not reality.
And one of the things I think linked to that I've heard you talk about in the past is that sometimes you become worried when school leaders allow the job to completely define them. And again, I know that's very hard to not do as a school leader because it does become your life, particularly in those senior roles where you're a head teacher. You know, the job does define. Why do you think that's a problem when school leaders get to that stage where they are entirely defined by the job they're doing?
Yeah, I think we're all defined to a certain extent by our jobs, and we can't help that. And I think, as you say, school leadership is to a great extent a vocation. However, if that becomes all you are, then when things go wrong, that's you as a person that's going down. And I can remember hearing once a school leader stand up in front of a group he was talking to saying, I am an outstanding school. And I kind of thought, yeah, and when your school at some stage isn't outstanding anymore, what's that going to say about you? Because we know that leaders identify with the school. If the school is found wanting, then it's very difficult for the leader not to feel, and I'm found wanting too.
Because you're invested so much in the school, aren't you? I think you invest so much of your time and energy and effort. It's unsurprising that happens, I guess.
It's not at all surprising. But if that's all there is to you, if you can't see yourself also as a father, a mother, a sister, you know, a friend, and all those things, which actually that doesn't touch when something goes wrong, well, I'm still the person I was. Then there's not much to fall back on. And I think that's when people really go under.
And the other thing I noticed in the book, you have this really fascinating anecdote about, I think it was a time when you were inspecting a school. You're certainly in a school, and I think you made a comment to one of the school leaders, or someone made a comment saying, this must be an incredibly draining job.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a really interesting response that struck a chord for me. I wonder if you could just tell that anecdote.
Yes. So it was a special school, actually, in the days when special schools often weren't very effective. And we'd come across this very effective school, and somebody, you must be working so hard. And he said, well, my staff are working really hard, but actually, if I were working as hard as they are, then when things get difficult, there's nothing in reserve. I have to keep a distance from what's going on in order that I can keep the hand on the tiller, if you like. I don't think that was the expression he used. But I also remember hearing from a colleague I used to work with talking at an MPQH session actually for people who were potential candidates, saying exactly the same thing, that you always need something in reserve. And if you look at any sort of crisis that happens in a school, you can see the truth of that.
And it's interesting because often we think about the importance of the servant leader,
Definitely.
the leader, I don't use the word martyr, but almost that, you know, I have to do everything, I have to kind of give every ounce of energy I've got.
Yes.
And actually that challenges our thinking, and it certainly challenged mine a bit about, well, actually, I can't, you know, give everything because I have to have a little bit back for those moments of crisis that inevitably will occur. And
Absolutely.
it's
That's
a really challenging way. Yeah, but it's a challenging thing for, I think, for leaders to think, isn't it? Because you feel slightly guilty almost, perhaps.
I think that's right, and I think it's important, therefore, to hang on to that sense of, when people say to me, I wouldn't ask my staff to do anything I wouldn't do, I can kind of see that, but it can very quickly become, I need to be seen to be as busy as they are. And that's about affirmation, and actually you need to be doing things differently. You probably will be as busy, but not as emotionally drained, hopefully, as they are, because otherwise when something happens, you won't have anything to call on. And I think that, that's where the leader earns his or her money in the long term, really.
And let's talk briefly about when things go wrong, about when leaders get to the stage where they do feel incredibly stressed. And there's always an element of stress to the job, but actually when it goes beyond the normal and you think actually there's a problem here. What would you say in your experience are the most common causes of those kind of stresses for school leaders? And again, importantly, are there any things that in the short term leaders can do when they feel that happening?
Common causes, I don't know how, whether there's a ranking here, but things that I've come across certainly, when leaders are working in a way they don't believe in. I think that's a huge stress. When they're not looking after themselves, all those, the opposite things that you ought to be doing, clearly. Relationships, not being able to manage relationships, not being able to keep a youngster who perhaps they don't want to exclude, but actually they've got to the end of the line, so it's very easy then for them to feel, I've let this child down. And I would say it's the system that's let their child down, actually. And heads are held responsible for things that they have no control over at all, things that happen far beyond youngsters coming, far before youngsters come to school. So I think being held accountable for things over which you have no control is stressful. What can they do? I think the first thing is to notice. And that might sound strange, but actually, I think in the book I talk about the boiling frog thing, that you don't notice until really you are almost overwhelmed, or even you are overwhelmed. So I think giving somebody else permission to say, are you okay? And not to round on them and say, of course I'm okay, so that you kind of have a pact with somebody. And actually to acknowledge that you're not, you are human and therefore you're vulnerable. And you're not superhuman. And while people want leaders to be strong, they don't want them to be vulnerable, but actually to be human is to be vulnerable. And who wants an inhuman leader?
And if someone's watching this now and thinking, I do need to do something about looking after myself better. If you could give them just one piece of advice, obviously there's a huge amount and a huge number of pieces of advice in your book, but if you could just tell them one thing to start with, what would you suggest, do you think?
Okay, I think first of all, if you've acknowledged that there's something I need to do, tell someone, ask for help. Because I think that's the thing, is that you feel completely isolated and you feel like nobody in the world has ever felt like you do, which is true, because I haven't. Because they're not you. But I think people are becoming more open about the stresses of the role and the impact on mental health. And people are worried about sharing that because they think it's a sign of weakness. And it's a sign of humanity. So I would say, seek help, pick up the phone, talk to a friend, just do something that allows you to put some of that somewhere else rather than just carrying the whole thing and the strain of the secrecy as well.
Julia, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you ever so much for watching. We'll see you again next time.